Timberline Fork, Wyoming Territory. October 1883. The high country had already flashed white on the ridgelines, and the valley moved like a hive. Men climbed roofs. Hands stuffed moss into log seams. Lime mortar went on in rushed lines. Everyone knew the routine. Seal the big cracks. Stack wood. Pray the wind stayed polite. Everyone but one cabin. Inside the Rourke place, Kellen Rourke, a quiet homesteader with Killine worker hands, dumped sifted gray ash into a wooden trough. He added blue river clay, screened sand, and hemp fibers teased apart like old rope. Water followed. He churned it with a paddle until it became a heavy paste that clung to the wood. He did not take it outside. He lifted a trowel and spread the mix across the interior logs, forcing it into every seam and knot line, every place a draft could hide. The wall stopped looking like timber. It began to look like one continuous skin. At the doorway stood Bram Haldane, the valley's oldest cabin builder, a man who had raised roofs than he could count. He watched for 3 breaths. Then his jaw set with professional offense. "You seal a log wall like that," he said, "and you'll rot it. You're building a tomb." Kellen did not argue. He did not explain. He dragged the trowel again, hard, pressing the gray paste into the joint like he was locking a door no one else could see. Behind him, Mara Rourke, his wife, held the lantern steady and said nothing. Her eyes stayed on the wet plaster. If this kind of frontier problem-solving matters, hit like, subscribe, and drop where you're watching from. Because when the wind blizzard of 1883 finally arrived, the difference between mockery and survival would not be a speech. It would be a number. The next morning, the valley returned to its familiar confidence. Hammers rang across Timberline Fork, boots scraped shingles, ladders leaned against every cabin wall. Men packed moss deep into the log gaps, then pressed lime mortar over it with gloved hands. The work moved fast and practiced. No one debated the method. It had always been done this way. Seal the big cracks and the heat stays in. Keep the stove fed, and winter can't touch you. Wood piles rose like monuments beside every doorway. Some stacked them higher than the roofline. A quiet competition measured in cords and pride. Axes fell in steady rhythm. Chips scattered across frost-stiff ground. Kellen Rourke did not join them. His own woodpile was modest. Enough, but not impressive. He split only what he needed that day and carried it inside without ceremony. No boasting, no counting. Instead, he crouched at the far corner of his cabin where the wall met the floor. Mara watched from the table as he pinched a small amount of dry ash between his fingers. He let it fall near the base log. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ash slid sideways. Not dropped, not blown, drawn. It crept along the floorboard seam and vanished into a line too small for a nail to enter. Kellen studied the empty place where it disappeared. He did not call anyone. He did not point. Outside, axes continued to strike, men satisfied with their work. No one noticed the cabin walls breathing. No one except him. Kellen did not explain what he had seen in the ash. He acted. By midday, he walked to the blacksmith shed and returned, carrying a small iron pail filled with sifted stove ash, gray as flour. He did not linger to talk. The men there assumed he needed lye or fertilizer. He corrected no one. At the creek bend below the cottonwoods, he cut into a bank of blue clay with a shovel and loaded it into a sack. The soil held together in heavy slabs, smooth and dense. He hauled it back alone. Behind the cabin, he set an old copper screen across 2 sawhorses and pushed river sand through it, shaking until only fine grains fell into a waiting trough. The coarser pebbles he discarded. Then he teased apart bundles of hemp tow and mixed in a small handful of coarse cow-tail hair gathered from the corral fence. Water followed. The paddle turned slowly. Clay, ash, and sand folded together into a thick, heavy paste. Mara watched from the doorway. He carried the first load inside, not outside. He pressed the mixture into the interior seam, where two logs met, forcing it deep with the trowel. Then another seam, then another. From floor to beam, the gray layer spread, closing lines that had been visible since the day the cabin stood. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly. Kellen paused only long enough to nod once. Then the trowel moved again, slow and firm, as if sealing the lid of a container he meant never to open. The gray layer had climbed halfway up the wall when boots sounded on the porch. Bram Haldane stepped inside without knocking, as men did in small valleys, where doors were more courtesy than barrier. He stopped 3 paces in and stared at the interior wall. The old builder's eyes moved slowly along the seams, then up toward the beam, following the line of plaster as though tracking a crack spreading through stone. He set his gloves on the table. "What are you doing, Rourke?" Kellen did not turn. The trowel moved once more across a seam. The wet surface shone in the lantern light. Bram stepped closer and ran a knuckle against the fresh coat. It thudded softly, not wood, not stone. His expression hardened, not anger, but alarm. "Logs breathe," he said evenly. "They always have. They take on damp, and they release it. That's why we chink the gaps and leave the timber open. You seal it like this, and the moisture stays trapped." He gestured toward the wall. "Come spring, rot will start in the heartwood. You won't see it at first. Then the corners soften. Then your pegs loosen. I've seen a cabin fail in 2 seasons, from less than this." Mara listened, but did not interrupt. Bram continued, patient, almost instructive. "Years back, a man tried oiling his interior boards, thought he was preserving them. Instead, he suffocated them. The walls sweated until the beams went soft. He didn't lose heat that winter. He lost the whole structure the next year. The valley trusted Bram because his warnings were rarely wrong. Kellen finally turned. He wiped the edge of the trowel against the trough and looked at the older man, not defensive, not proud. "I'm not sealing the wood," he said. Bram waited. "I'm sealing the wind." The room went still, except for the low fire. Bram studied his face for a moment, measuring whether this was stubbornness or misunderstanding. What he saw gave him no answer. To him, the statement sounded like a mistake, stated with confidence. Not malice, not madness. Just a man misjudging a material he did not fully respect. He picked up his gloves again. "You'll learn," he said quietly. "I just hope winter doesn't teach it too hard." Then he stepped back into the cold air, leaving the wet plaster gleaming in the lantern light and the argument unresolved. Bram saw a cabin being smothered by mud, but Kellen's mind was already miles and years away, anchored in the white-hot, airtight logic of the Nebraska kilns. Kellen Rourke had not learned his habits in a cabin. Years before Timberline Fork, before he owned a shovel or a claim, he worked east in Nebraska camps, where railroad crews burned lime and fired brick for expanding tract towns. He was not a mason in the formal sense. He was the man who kept the kilns alive. A kiln was a simple structure to look at. Stone walls, fire below, heat above, but it behaved like a living thing. If the chamber held steady heat, the load cured clean and strong. If it lost heat, even slightly, the entire firing failed. And failure rarely came from a large opening. It came from cracks too small to notice. A seam no wider than a fingernail. A loose stone along the arch. Air would pull through that gap, and where air moved, heat followed. Not through the rock, through the path. One leak could cool a chamber large enough to stand inside. A week's fuel wasted, a month's labor ruined. The lesson was simple and permanent. Heat did not escape the way men imagined. It did not fight walls. It followed moving air. Kellen carried that knowledge west with his tools, though few there had ever needed it before. Kellen saw the paths of the wind through a Killine worker's eyes, but to the people of Timberline Fork, he was just a fool plastering over his own future. The valley did not argue with Kellen directly. It talked around him. At the Timberline General Store, men gathered near the flour barrels and the pot-bellied stove, trading weather guesses and counting how many cords each had split. The talk paused when the door opened and Kellen stepped inside carrying a pail of fine gray ash. He crossed the room without greeting and set the pail beside the counter to trade for lamp oil. Jed Larkin, a broad-shouldered farmer known more for his tongue than his acreage, watched him with open curiosity. "You see that?" Jed said to no one and everyone. "Man's building his house out of what's left after the fire dies." A few men chuckled. Jed leaned back against a sack of feed and added, "Won't need a coffin when winter comes. He's already made one." Someone asked, "What do you call it then?" Jed didn't hesitate. "The Gray Tomb." The phrase landed clean. It was short, easy to remember, and carried a picture with it. Laughter followed, not cruel, just certain. The kind that spreads because it feels obvious. Bram Haldane stood near the stove but said nothing. He did not need to. His earlier warning had already done its work. The nickname simply finished it. From that day forward, the name stuck. Men used it casually when they passed the Rourke place. Children repeated it without knowing why. Dust settled on boots, frost formed on window edges, and the name clung to the cabin, the same way ash clung to Kellen's hands, light, persistent, and impossible to brush away. That evening, the laughter stayed outside, but its echo followed him home. The cabin smelled of damp earth and warm wood. Half the walls were gray now, the lower courses covered, the upper logs still bare. The lantern light flattened the surface, so the plaster looked less like mud and more like soft stone still curing. Mara ran her hand lightly along the finished section. She did not praise it. She did not criticize it. She simply felt its coolness. "They are certain," she said, after a long while. Kellen sat on the stool near the door, sharpening a draw knife. Slow strokes, steady rhythm. She looked at him, not accusing, not fearful, just practical. "If they are right, what then?" she asked. "If the wood rots in the spring?" The knife paused once, then moved again. Kellen set it aside and walked to the door. Along the bottom edge, where the frame met the plank floor, a thin line of darkness marked a gap no wider than a matchstick. A faint current touched the back of his hand even with the door closed. "Stone doesn't kill heat," he said quietly. "Air does." He pressed his palm against the seam. In the kiln yards, a wall could be 3 feet thick. It still failed if the air found a path. The fire never lost to the rock. It lost to the draft. Mara stepped beside him. The cold was barely felt, yet it was there. Patient, steady, working inward. He kept his hand over the gap. "Heat doesn't leave because it is weak," he said. "It leaves because it is carried." She placed her hand over his. She did not say she believed him. She did not say he was right. "Then don't let it find a road," she said. Neither of them spoke after that. The fire settled into coals, and the wind outside moved along the walls, searching for entrances that were slowly disappearing. The next afternoon brought family instead of neighbors. Ephraim Rourke, Kellen's older cousin and a teamster who hauled freight between settlements, tied his horses outside and stepped in without ceremony. He looked first at Mara, then at the walls, and his expression tightened. He walked along the gray surface, touching it once with his fingertips. "So, it's true," he said. "You're covering the logs." Kellen said nothing. Ephraim turned back toward him. "Men are talking, Kell. They figure you don't trust your own work. A man hides poor joinery. A good cabin doesn't need hiding." There was no cruelty in his tone, only concern wrapped in bluntness. "You built this place yourself," he went on. "Now you smear mud over it like you're ashamed of it." Mara watched but did not intervene. Kellen picked up a small tack from the table and pressed it into a bare section of wall near the corner where plaster had not yet reached. From a spool he pulled a single strand of thread and tied it loosely to the metal point. The line hung still for a breath. Then it shifted. Not much, just enough to tremble. Though no door moved and no flame flickered, Ephraim leaned closer. Kellen stepped aside and let him see the narrow seam between the floorboard and the lowest log. The thread angled toward it. "I'm not hiding the wood," Kellen said quietly. "I'm stopping what harms it." The thread quivered again, pulled by a current no one could feel directly. "The rot you fear," he continued, "comes after this. First comes the air." Ephraim watched the moving line for several seconds. His brow furrowed, but the idea did not settle. He straightened. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe you're seeing ghosts in the grain." He removed his hat and shook his head once, unconvinced. Concern had brought him. Concern left with him. 2 days later, the matter left gossip and entered record. A wagon approached along the frozen track, its wheels creaking under a thin coat of frost. The driver carried a ledger case instead of tools. Mr. Whitcomb, the territorial land inspector, climbed down carefully and brushed dust from his coat before knocking. He did not remove his gloves when he entered. His eyes went first to the walls. He walked the interior slowly, saying nothing for nearly a minute. Then he raised the butt of his pen and tapped the plastered log. The sound was dull and solid, not the hollow thud of exposed timber. He tapped again, in a different place. Same sound. Whitcomb opened his ledger and turned to a page marked with neat columns. "The Homestead Standard is clear," he said in a voice without anger. "Log construction. Exterior chinking. Interior timber left open for ventilation." His pen hovered above the paper. "This interior sheathing does not appear in any approved method." He wrote a short note. "I cannot certify this dwelling as compliant construction." He was not threatening. He was simply recording. Kellen stood near the hearth, listening. "If the structure fails through moisture retention," Whitcomb continued, "your claim becomes disputable. Improvements must meet recognized practice." The words were plain, but their meaning was not. It was no longer about ridicule. It was about ownership. The cabin was the proof of settlement. Without it, the land itself could be lost. Behind Kellen, Mara held the back of a chair. Her expression did not change, but her fingers tightened around the wood. Whitcomb closed the ledger. "I advise reconsideration," he said. "Winter is not forgiving of experiments." Kellen looked once at the gray wall, then back at the inspector. "Winter will decide," he said quietly. Whitcomb gave a small nod, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, and stepped back into the cold, leaving the verdict unwritten but very real. The first cold night did not bring a storm. It brought a test. The temperature fell quietly after sundown. No snow, no violence, just a steady, creeping chill that settled over Timberline Fork. Kellen built a modest fire and let it burn low and even, not the roaring kind men used to chase away fear. The gray walls reflected the glow, and for a while the room held a comfortable warmth. Mara set a candle on the table while she folded blankets. At first, everything seemed to work. The air did not move across their faces. The usual drafts at shoulder height were gone. The cabin felt calmer than it ever had. Then she paused. Not a complaint. Not even a word. She simply shifted her feet slightly away from the far corner near the bed. Kellen noticed. He said nothing and watched the candle. The flame did not flicker wildly. It stood mostly upright, but every so often, it leaned just slightly toward the floor along the outer wall. Each time it corrected itself, then leaned again a few minutes later. He walked to the corner and crouched. Along the baseboard where the floor met the lowest log, the air carried a faint sensation like cool water flowing around a stone. Barely there, but persistent. A narrow path, hidden and patient. The walls were sealed. The wind was not finished. Kellen sat back on his heels and studied the place for a long moment. He understood then what the kiln had taught him years before. Closing the chamber walls meant nothing if the draft found another road. He rose, gathered more plaster, and knelt beside the threshold. He packed the mixture into the joint between the doorframe and sill, forcing it deep, then worked along the floor seam, sealing each hidden channel like a miner collapsing a tunnel. The candle straightened. For the first time that night, it did not lean again. Kellen did not smile. He only returned the trowel to the trough and watched the quiet flame, knowing he had not solved winter, yet only come closer to the right question. Morning followed without ceremony, and work resumed. Kellen began before sunrise. Frost still held the ground stiff, while the sky was only a pale band over the ridge. He carried a shovel to the creek bank and cut again into the blue clay seam he had found earlier. He did not take it all. He chose carefully, avoiding sandy pockets, selecting the dense sections that lifted in heavy, smooth slabs. He tested each load the same way. A small piece was rolled between his palms into a thin cord. He bent it slowly into a circle. If it cracked, he discarded the batch. If it held its curve without breaking, it went into the sack. Back at the cabin, the clay went into the trough. He screened river sand through the copper mesh until it fell as fine as flour. Pebbles and coarse grains stayed behind. Next came the ash. He sifted it twice through cloth until it became a pale powder that coated his hands like chalk. The mixture followed a rhythm now. Clay first, sand second, ash third. Water last, poured slowly while the paddle turned. The mass thickened and darkened, growing heavy and cohesive. From a nail on the wall, he pulled down the bundle of hemp tow. He separated the fibers and dropped them into the mix, along with a small handful of coarse cow hair. The strands disappeared into the paste, but changed its behavior. The trowel no longer cut through it cleanly. It dragged, stretching the material instead of breaking it. He carried the first load inside. The work changed from mixing to placing. Kellen forced the initial coat deep into the log joints, pushing hard enough that the material disappeared into spaces invisible from the outside. This first layer was not meant to look smooth. It was meant to reach where hands could not. He scraped it across knots and cracks and corners, leaving rough ridges that locked into the wood grain. Only after every seam was filled did he begin the second coat. The trowel moved slower now. He pressed and drew it upward, flattening the surface into a continuous plane. Each stroke overlapped the last, compressing the fibers within the plaster. The wall gradually lost its pattern of stacked logs. Lines softened, gaps vanished. Mara kept a small kettle near the hearth and maintained a steady, low fire. Too much heat would dry the plaster too quickly and split it. Too little, and it would never set. She added small sticks, never large ones, watching the surface as carefully as Kellen watched his trowel. Steam rose faintly from the damp walls in the mornings. By afternoon, the surface lightened from dark gray to a softer shade. Each day it hardened further. The sounds inside the cabin changed as well. Echoes dulled, the outside noises faded. Even footsteps sounded different, as if absorbed by the walls rather than thrown back into the room. Kellen worked around the entire interior, corners, window frames, the beam ends near the roof. He packed the mixture around the door casing until no visible line remained. He checked the floor seams again, sealing every junction where moving air might travel. Days passed in repetition. Mix, carry, press, smooth. The plaster no longer looked like a coating. It looked structural, a continuous shell set inside the cabin. Where the lantern light struck it, the wall reflected a soft glow instead of the rough shadow of logs. One evening, as the last section near the rafters was completed, Kellen stepped back and rested the trowel. The room appeared carved rather than assembled. There were no seams left to follow with the eye, no channels for a draft to reveal itself. Only a pale gray enclosure holding the quiet warmth of a small fire. No one announced success, but the cabin had become a single piece. The work ended quietly. No celebration marked it. No neighbor came to admire it. The last trowel stroke simply removed the final visible seam, and the cabin stood in a new condition that looked almost ordinary, unless one knew what to notice. That evening the fire burned low and steady. The air inside felt different, though nothing visible explained why. Mara sat near the table mending a sleeve, while Kellen split a short scrap of pine into kindling. He paused and held one of the cut pieces in his hand. "Come here," he said. She stepped beside him. Kellen lifted the small block and held one end toward her. He blew gently across its face. She felt a faint breath of air emerge from the other side where the grain opened. He turned it and blew again. The current shifted, finding another path through the fibers. "Wood isn't solid," he said. "It's a bundle of tiny passages." He placed the piece near the lantern flame. The flame leaned, reacting to the invisible current escaping through the grain. The cold doesn't push in, he continued. The warm air leaves. He looked around the room, then rested his palm lightly against the plastered wall. A house isn't a shield. He waited a moment. It's a jug. Mara followed his gaze. The walls no longer felt like a barrier keeping weather out. They felt like a container holding something inside. She nodded once and returned to her chair. No further question was needed. 3 weeks passed. The plaster hardened day by day, changing first from dark gray to pale ash, then to a surface that felt dry and cool to the touch. The damp earth smell faded. What replaced it was harder to name. Sound changed. Wind still moved outside. The cottonwoods bent. Loose snow skittered along the ground, but inside, those noises arrived softened, as if the walls absorbed them before they could cross the room. Even the creak of the roof timbers seemed distant. The candle on the table burned straight, not steady, for a moment, steady always. The stovepipe carried smoke upward in a clean column without wavering. The fire no longer surged and faded with each passing gust beyond the walls. Mara noticed first when she woke before dawn. Her feet touched the floor, reminding her of many mornings before winter. But the usual cold bite at the bedside was gone. The air at ankle height matched the air at her shoulders. She said nothing. She only looked toward the corner where drafts had once lived. Kellen walked to the wall and pressed a small tack into the plaster. He tied a single strand of thread to it and stepped back. The line hung vertical. Minutes passed, it did not tremble. Outside, a breeze brushed the roof and stirred loose snow along the eaves. Inside, the thread remained motionless, suspended in still air. The cabin no longer resisted the weather. It held something instead. The vessel was sealed. Now it only waited for judgment. The judgment did not arrive slowly. It came in a single afternoon. The sky dimmed without clouds. Then the wind rose. Not a steady wind, a cutting one. Snow did not fall from above. It traveled sideways, thrown across the valley in white sheets that erased distance and direction. Fences vanished. Tracks disappeared within minutes. Doors slammed. Windows rattled. Men rushed to latch shutters and pull livestock tight against barns. Speech became useless outside. The air itself carried ice sharp enough to sting exposed skin. The storm did not pause at nightfall. It strengthened. The sound of it was constant, a sawing roar along rooflines and corners where the current struck hardest. Snow climbed the cabin walls and packed against doors until the lower panels vanished beneath drifts. By morning, entryways were half buried. No one traveled. No one visited. The valley closed. Then, as suddenly as it began, the wind stopped. The silence was worse. The sky cleared to a hard blue that offered no warmth. The cold settled in behind the storm, deep and absolute. At the post station, the mercury column sank to 41 degrees below zero and stayed there. Timbers contracted. Sharp cracks echoed across the valley like distant rifle fire as frozen wood split along its grain. Smoke rose thin and straight from chimneys that could still draw. Inside every cabin, fires were fed harder. Outside, the landscape held its breath. The court had opened, and no man could leave the room. Inside the Rourke cabin, the storm did not exist in the same way. The fire burned small, not starved, not roaring, just steady. Mara sat at the table with a needle and thread, mending a sleeve as if it were an ordinary evening. No one wore coats. No blankets were wrapped around shoulders. The warmth did not gather only near the hearth and fade across the floor. It filled the room. Kellen worked a loose latch on the door, shaving a thin curl of wood from the edge so it would seat tighter in the frame. He tested it once, closed it, and the iron catch settled into place with a soft click. He stepped outside to the woodpile. The cold struck instantly. Air cut the lungs. Snow packed hard under his boots. He lifted 2 logs and returned quickly, frost forming along his beard before he reached the threshold. He opened the door. Wind pushed in behind him. He closed it. The sound stopped. The moving air vanished. The warmth remained, unchanged, as though the outside had never crossed the boundary at all. The cabin did not fight the cold. It ignored it. The rest of Timberline Fork did not share that stillness. In Jed Larkin's cabin, the fire never rested. He fed it constantly, log after log disappearing into the stove, as if the iron mouth consumed heat faster than wood could create it. The room nearest the hearth was tolerable. 2 steps away, the floor stiffened with frost. A bucket of water near the wall formed a thin sheet of ice by morning. His wife wrapped blankets around the children and kept them close to the stove. Still, their breath showed in the air. Jed stared at the shrinking pile of split logs outside the door. It had been enough for a normal winter. This winter was not normal. The fire demanded more. At dusk, he went to the shed and returned, carrying the broken handrail from his father's old wagon, smooth wood worn by years of use. He hesitated only a moment before placing it on the chopping block. The axe fell. The pieces went into the stove. The heat rose briefly, then faded again. Across the valley, Bram Haldane's cabin stood tight and well-made, its joinery as careful as any he had built. Yet drafts crept along the floor and through the corners. His wife coughed through the night, her breath shallow in the cold air. They hung a canvas tarp around the hearth, forming a small enclosure meant to trap the warmth. The fire roared inside that narrow space, but the rest of the room stayed bitter. Bram moved his hand along the wall. Cold leaked through seams he could not see. He checked the chinking he had placed himself weeks earlier. It was intact. Still, the heat vanished. He stopped feeding the fire for a moment and watched the smoke pull harder up the chimney than it should. Something was taking the warmth, and it was not the wood. On the 7th night, Bram Haldane stopped feeding his own fire. He wrapped his wife in blankets and led her carefully through the hard snowdrifts, guiding her by lantern light across the short distance to the Rourke place. The air bit at every breath. Each step sank to the knee where the wind had piled the snow. He knocked once. Kellen opened the door. The first sensation was not heat. It was absence. No moving air. No biting edge along the face. Just a deep, even warmth that settled into the lungs. They stepped inside. Bram removed a small pocket thermometer from his coat, a habit he had kept from years of measuring winter nights during construction. He held it at arm's length in the center of the room, far from the hearth. He waited. The column steadied at 58 degrees. Outside, the cold could kill exposed skin within minutes. Bram looked at Kellen, not in anger, not in embarrassment, but in confusion that turned slowly into recognition. Kellen said nothing. Mara placed a small board on the table and pushed a tack into it. From it hung a thin thread. "Hold it by the wall," she said. Bram knelt and brought the thread close to the base of the plastered corner, where drafts always lived in every cabin he had known. The thread did not move, not once. He stayed there longer than necessary, watching for the smallest tremor. There was none. He rose slowly. For a long moment he simply stood, understanding, replacing certainty. Then he spoke the only words that mattered. "Show me the mix." 2 days later, the wind loosened its grip on the valley. The cold remained, but the roar was gone. Smoke began to rise again in slow, steady columns as men opened doors that had been sealed by snow. The settlement emerged carefully, each family measuring what winter had taken. Mr. Whitcomb rode back through Timberline Fork to inspect the homesteads. He moved from cabin to cabin, making notes in his ledger. Frozen water buckets, split beams, half-burned furniture stacked near stoves. He did not need to ask many questions. Survival was visible. When he reached the Rourke cabin, he paused at the doorway longer than before. Warm air met him, but more noticeable was the stillness. He stepped inside, closed the door, and removed his gloves. He looked around once, then shut the ledger without writing. "I see," was all he said. Word traveled faster than any messenger, not by boasting, by observation. Bram Haldane was the one who began it. The builder who had warned against the plaster now returned carrying a shovel and a sack. He did not bring tools to build a new cabin. He brought them to alter old ones. He showed Jed Larkin how to sift ash. He helped neighbors pack seams from the inside instead of the outside. Groups formed without announcement. Work parties moved from house to house, mixing troughs of clay and ash, pressing the mixture along base logs, door frames, and corners where drafts hid. Jed did not apologize. He carried buckets. The nickname changed without discussion. No one called it the Gray Tomb anymore. They called it the Rourke Seal. By the next winter, the difference was measurable. Woodpiles lasted longer. Fires burned lower. Mornings began without frost, inside bedrooms. The valley did not grow wealthy, but it grew secure. Records from the trading post showed families using roughly a third less fuel than the year before. Kellen Rourke did not give instructions like a teacher. He showed motions. Press here, seal there, watch the flame, watch the thread. The others learned, not by explanation, but by result. Mara kept the kettle warm for whoever came to help. She spoke little of the winter that proved it. No monument marked the change. No speech recorded it. Kellen continued, as he always had, checking seams, repairing small cracks before they widened, treating every line in a wall as a path the wind might someday discover. The same habit he had learned in the kiln yards followed him still. A structure fails first, where air is allowed to move. In Timberline Fork, the lesson endured longer than the storm itself. On the frontier, arguments were settled not by opinion, but by what remained standing when the cold finished speaking. After seeing this, would you have trusted Kellen's ash and clay seal before the blizzard, or laughed with the town? Tell me in the comments.